I'm going to keep really brief here. My name is Brian McGuire. I'm an associate professor of English, and I'm also the teaching and learning fellow through the Lash Center. And that gives me this great opportunity to put together with the rest of the Lash support staff and everybody else that's there. It's great. And Chris is here today with us, helping me through this. We're able to put together these great academic lectures, and I'm so happy to welcome back to the academic lecture Emily Zekin-Brown. And I'm going to introduce her in 1 second for those who might not know who she is, but I'm sure almost everybody here does, for all the great work that she does here at the school. But I would also like to remind everybody that this is our final academic lecture of the fall. And in the spring, we're doing some new and exciting things with the academic lecture, kind of riding the coattails of yet another one of Emily's great ideas of lectures in the library series. And rather than competing with lectures in the library series, we would like to join forces and work as a team. But we have some really exciting things in the works. So please keep that on your radar. And I'm sure we'll be doing more promoting of this as we go through the break and into the spring semester. With that all being said, I'd like to just briefly introduce, as I said, Emily Zekin-Brown, and she's the coordinator of library research and instruction here at Bristol. And she joined us in 2013 after working at the University of Central Oklahoma. She holds a master's degree in library and information science from the University of Pittsburgh and a certificate of graduate study in Holocaust and genocide education from Rowan University. She is currently pursuing a second master's degree in history, concentrating on the study of the Holocaust and genocide. Her research interests include open source intelligence and its potential evidentiary use in regard to prosecutions for war crimes, including genocide, the potential for disinformation to exacerbate societies at risk for genocide, and the potential for AI to complicate all of this. And I had mentioned that she is rejoining because I think it was just a little over a year ago. She also gave a great academic lecture along with Robin Worthington and Ron Weisberger on genocide. And a year before that, she was part of the wonderful series of lectures, A More Perfect Union, Diffusing Disinformation. And so Emily was wondering, why such a good crowd? I think, Emily, you've proven yourself as a wonderful presenter and presenting on these engaging topics that people find really meaningful. And so we're so happy to have you back. So that's that. And thank you.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm lucky to have such amazing colleagues that provide such awesome opportunities to do incredible research and talk to you guys about it. I am beyond lucky. So thank you very much. I am going to go ahead and share my screen and make sure I can see all of you at the same. All right. So at 3:15 a.m. on February 23rd, 2022, in Belgorod, Russia, there was a traffic jam. It seemed too early for a traffic jam, but Jeffrey Lewis, who was watching the traffic pile up on Google Maps, was watching it in real time. Lewis, a professor specializing in arms control and nonproliferation at Middlebury Institute of International Studies, quickly realized what was happening. A Russian invasion was moving towards the border with Ukraine. Lewis and his team of students compared the Google Maps traffic with radar imagery and realized, hours ahead of any public announcement, that the Russian invasion of Ukraine had begun. This is one form of real-time open source intelligence being used to track and document the Russian war in Ukraine. Thank you for joining me today to talk about some of the research I did last year on the use of open source intelligence and its possible use in prosecuting your war crimes in the future. There's a lot here and a lot to talk about, and a lot has happened since I wrote this paper. To do this research, I joined several Telegram channels that were sharing open source information from Ukraine as well as Russia, as well as followed a number of open source investigations. I do want to warn you, though, that researching this was incredibly difficult, and I looked at a lot of very difficult things. I did my best to censor those today, and none of the images I will share will be graphic in nature. But if you do choose to pursue open source intelligence evidence on your own, you will see very disturbing imagery. After all, we are talking about war crimes and genocide. So first, I want to talk about what it is to be open source intelligence, what that means. Open source intelligence is anything that is publicly available that any member of the public can observe, purchase, or request without requiring special legal status or unauthorized access. In opposite of that is considered closed source intelligence, and that's information that has restricted access that is protected by law, but that may be obtained legally through private channels such as the judicial process or that which is offered voluntarily. Open source intelligence has played a role in the intelligence community since the Second World War. Some of you might be familiar with a predecessor to the CIA called the OSS. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union all began to ramp up their collection and analyzation of open source intelligence. By the Cold War, both the CIA and the KGB were using open source intelligence to keep tabs on each other's military, economic, and political movements. After 9/11, an open source center was created under the Director of National Intelligence, but has since been shut down. This has led to the rise of private open source intelligence groups, many of which I will discuss in the presentation today. Those include organizations such as Bellingcat, Truth Hounds, Eyes on Russia, Mnemonic, and the Center for Information Resilience. I'd like to take a second here and escape from my presentation just to show you some of the websites. These are all live, active, open source investigatory organizations. Many of them are active in current conflicts in Gaza today. This is Bellingcat. This is the Eyes on Russia map. If you are following the war in Ukraine, these are documented instances of conflict that are being tracked. This is Mnemonic, and they are actually archiving and providing informational infrastructure that provides people in conflict areas the opportunity to document. And I will provide links to all of this stuff at the end, so don't worry about writing all of this down. But they provide all sorts of information for a lot of different conflicts worldwide. So they're supporting people. They have a Syrian archive, Yemeni, Sudanese, and Ukrainian, and I'll kind of touch on Syria again in a minute. There's Truth Hounds that is also active in the open source investigation, and then the Center for Information Resilience. So these are all organizations that I will refer to from time to time. Okay. These organizations specialize in the collection and archiving of open source intelligence in the hopes that the perpetrators of war crimes and genocides can eventually be tried for their crimes. In a real way, the war in Syria gave rise to the non-governmental open source intelligence organizations I just mentioned. This gruesome war, which involved numerous war crimes, provided the digital education that was quickly mobilized in Ukraine. Bellingcat investigated chemical warfare deployed in Syria, as well as munitions used in the conflict. The ability to prove things like the use of barrel bombs is crucial to future prosecutions, if there are to be any. Mnemonic started their digital archive program that cached, verified, and archived over 8,000 pieces of video evidence in Syria. You can use your phone to scan the code and go to Mnemonic's Syrian archive. Many of these groups have been instrumental in the collection of verification and archiving of open source intelligence in Ukraine and obviously other conflicts. I'm sure you're wondering, though, how this information is investigated, collected, cataloged, and archived, let alone verified. All of this is extremely important if it's to be used in a criminal court. First, let's talk about the use of open source intelligence and its prosecution of war crimes. According to a 2018 Eurojust report published at The Hague, at least 10 cases resulting in prison sentences have resulted from the use of open source intelligence as evidence. Many of the cases occurred in and around Iraq and involved the conviction of men posing with either the decapitated heads of their victims or their bodies, and then posting those pictures to social media. These 10 cases often had to do with the desecration of the dead, but in some cases also involved the accused posing with the dying. In at least one case, the graphic execution of 7 captured Syrian soldiers was published online and resulted in a life sentence. As uncomfortable as this is, we should remember that if justice is served, these pieces of evidence could be used in war crimes and genocides trials, as we have just seen. So what would it take for open source intelligence to be used in criminal trials at The Hague or other tribunal locations? It's clear that digital evidence can be altered and manipulated, so verifying open source intelligence is imperative for its potential evidentiary use. The organizations that participate in collecting open source intelligence verify it through geolocation, redundancy, and object inspection. The rules are laid out in the Berkeley Protocol on Digital Open Source Investigations from the UC Berkeley Human Rights Center, which identifies a number of verification strategies that must be used during open source investigation. Source analysis, these include source analysis, technical analysis, content analysis, and investigative analysis. Here's a QR code to this incredibly detailed report. In addition to the investigational outline, the Berkeley Protocol provides a legal framework in which organizations can collect open source evidence of war crimes. The protocol recommends that the laws that will apply depend on the identities of the investigators, the identities of their targets, the purpose and jurisdiction of the targets in which their targets and the digital data and the legal processes are located. The protocol dictates that the material must be preserved in a way that maintains authenticity and documents a chain of custody that will increase the likelihood that it can be admitted as evidence in a court of law. Does that make sense? Right? So they have to maintain a chain of custody. Each investigator must be aware that violating an individual's right to privacy could lead to the exclusion of evidence in a court of law. So hacking can't, you can't hack things. The protocol also acknowledges that possessing such evidence would make an organization a target for their own hacking or other disruptive measures, and thus recommends minimum standards for digital security infrastructures. Another interesting aspect to the protocol is the chapter on psychological as well as technological preparation. Of course, organizations have to be technologically prepared to assess threats and the information landscape, but the investigators themselves will also be exposed to violent and traumatic material. It's important that investigators of open source intelligence and evidence understand what they might see when they begin to track genocide and war crimes. As I mentioned earlier, the protocol lays out an investigatory cycle that begins with online inquiries, which is a process for discovering the information itself. There's a preliminary assessment that's performed, which is a process that determines whether or not the information should be collected at all. If the information is deemed collectible, the information is captured and preserved, which ensures that the information is securely stored and retrievable. This means that it can't be deleted or changed or altered in a later state, right? So like the image that is captured at the time is basically saved in that format. The information is then verified and investigated, which are processes that evaluate the reliability of the source that posted it, and the content, and then they interpret the data and draw conclusions. Gaps in knowledge are identified and further investigative routes are followed. This is an incredibly detailed report. If you are at all interested in how the Berkeley Protocol lays out open source guidelines and protocols for investigation, it's a really great thing to kind of pay attention to. The Berkeley Protocol bases its field of common rules, guidelines, and professional standards for open source investigations on the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907 and the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and 1977. And those both define which types of weaponry or actions during war are in violation of international humanitarian law. Additionally, investigators rely on Article 8 of the Rome Statute and Article 3.1c of the Geneva Conventions of 1949 to define potential war crimes. Traditional internet investigations of or international investigations of war crimes or genocide often happen long after the conclusion of the events themselves, which creates a variety of barriers to investigation. Perpetrators at times attempt to conceal their crimes. At other times, even something as simple as weather is a factor in the obliteration of crime scenes. Over times, witnesses may be intimidated or their memories could come into question. For these reasons, open source evidence verification and collection can supplement later on the ground traditional investigatory practices by international bodies. In May of 2022, the United Nations Human Rights Council adopted Resolution S34-1, which established the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine. The commission delivered its first report in October of the same year, concluding Russia was guilty of war crimes, violations of human rights, and breaches of humanitarian law during its invasion in Ukraine. Undoubtedly, the evidence collected by Bellingcat, Mnemonic, Truth Hounds, and the Ukrainian government will be used in international criminal court should it be convened. Ukraine began collecting open source intelligence after the Euromaidan protests of 2013 and the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014. Domestic humanitarian groups like Euromaidan SOS, the Center for Civil Liberties, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2022 for their work, and the 5AM coalition grew out of these conflicts. The Ukrainian federal government has also created a number of apps and programs in order to collect open source intelligence from the general Ukrainian population. In 2020, the Ukrainian government unveiled a web portal called DIA, which allowed citizens to upload personal identification documents that could be used to access government services at a number of benefit agencies. After the invasion in 2022, this portal was overhauled in order to allow up to 250,000 citizens in Russian-occupied territories to submit footage of Russian troop movements and other pieces of covert intelligence. As the Russians withdrew from Kiev and other occupied cities and towns, Ukrainian citizens uploaded digital evidence of war crimes. Apps designed specifically to capture open source intelligence allow for facial recognition of Russian soldiers and allow citizens to categorize their submissions by type of war crime and human rights violations. Ukrainian journalists have also played a crucial role in documenting the Russian invasion. A team of journalists at Splitsvo have used their journalistic skills to identify members of the Russian military active on Ukrainian soil. Splitsvo has partnered with the Ukrainian organization Anti-Corruption Headquarters to provide access to a public database listing Russian soldiers and their military divisions active in Ukraine. As of the writing of my paper in December of 2022, the database contained over 15,000 names. As of this morning, it contained up to 182,102 names of Russian soldiers. And these all come from soldiers who took selfies and posted them on the internet and were tracked via facial recognition. If you're at all interested, here is a QR code to that database if you'd like to peruse it further. You can also just Google it. I will now turn to a number of open source investigations conducted in Ukraine regarding potential war crimes charges. Over 100 states have signed on to the Convention on Cluster Munitions, though neither Russia nor Ukraine have done so. The convention prohibits the use of cluster munitions, which are especially destructive due to their ability to disperse and explode over a wide area. Open source investigators at Bellingcat and the Center for Information Resilience, or the CIR, have been able to identify specific ordinances used by Russia in Ukraine, including cluster bombs, cluster rockets, and ballistic missiles. All of these have been identified in attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure using open source intelligence. In February, video evidence showed that cluster munitions were used near a residential area, a children's hospital, a kindergarten, and a church. Evidence appears to show that Russians were firing into cities and towns indiscriminately, not taking care to avoid civilians or civilian infrastructure. Rule 54 of the International Humanitarian Law prohibits attacks on objects indispensable to the survival of civilian populations, and attacks on medical facilities are likely to constitute a war crime in this context. Similarly, oh, I know what happened. Don't you love it when you're talking to yourself in a room full of people? Oh. And it's being recorded. Where was I? Similarly, and later in February, a hospital was attacked outside of the city of Veldahar in Donetsk Oblast. The attack killed 4 civilians and wounded 10 after a Smerch cluster munition exploded. The ordnance was identified using manufacturing markings, tail fin configurations, and the munition container holes visible as after the explosion, as you can see here. On April 8th, a Russian missile strike hit a railway station in Donetsk Oblast. Roughly 4,000 civilians were at the station waiting to board trains that would take them out of the war zone. The strike killed over 60 people, including children, and wounded over 100. The following investigation involved footage shared after the attack and resulted in the identification of a Tochka U rocket booster, which was found at the scene. In this specific case, the CIR was able to use the European Space Agency's Sentinel-2 satellite, which passed over the area from where cluster munitions were launched, to identify patches of burning grass and confirm that the missiles were launched from Russian-held territory at the time of the attack. In addition to the satellite imagery, the attack on the train station was captured on video, which was uploaded to Telegram and archived by the Wayback Machine. The CIR was able to geolocate and confirm that missiles were indeed launched from Russian-held territory. In August of 2022, Bellingcat researchers published the results of an open source investigation on the mutilation and execution of a Ukrainian soldier. Using videos posted on a Russian Telegram channel, Bellingcat was able to geolocate the site of the execution to a sanatorium in Luhansk. The person who carried out the castration and execution can be seen in the footage. The person in question, who can be identified by a distinctive cowboy hat decorated with shells, has appeared in other footage from Ukraine. This is a Russian state media post, and he can be seen in the background. Using digital evidence techniques, Bellingcat was able to locate telephone numbers for this individual in order to question him. He denied that he executed the Ukrainian soldier, surprisingly, but admitted he was a Russian soldier in Ukraine at the time. If you'd like to read the report, here's the QR code for that. Open source intelligence investigations are also playing a role in Bucha, one of the scenes of the early mass violence in the Russian war in Ukraine. Human Rights Watch has documented 16 unlawful killings in Bucha, 9 summary executions, and 7 indiscriminate killings of civilians. Much of the open source intelligence focuses on Yablunska Street in Bucha. The New York Times and Human Rights Watch investigated the summary executions on Yablunska Street, publishing the open source evidence. In places like Bucha, Mariupol, Cherniv, and Kherson, where Russian occupation lasted weeks or months, much of the documentation of mass violence and potential war crimes comes from satellite imagery. Oh, this is taken directly from the New York Times exploration of Bucha. And if you haven't read this, this is a really fascinating, they do a very graphic exploration, not graphic in the violent sense. I mean, it's violent because it's war crimes, but like they put together the open source information in a way that really shows you how they piece things together. And I think this is the QR code to that. But like I said, at the end, I have links to everything. So like I said, in places like Bucha, Mariupol, and Kherson, satellite imagery is one of the main things that they use to track violence. And one of the things they do is track mass graves. Mass graves have been located in each of these territories. 2 reports by the CIR in April and July of 2002 used open source intelligence to determine the location and development of mass grave sites. The city of Cherniv in northern Ukraine was heavily bombarded by artillery in the first weeks of the Russian invasion as forces pushed towards Kiev. The April investigation found evidence of mass graves in the forest nearby, which were dug in February and March. Footage posted on social media enabled the CIR to estimate the number of dead between 323 to 383 people, though Ukrainian officials estimate the number could have been as high as 700. Using satellite imagery, the CIR was also able to identify the location of the photos posted to a Russian language news site, Meduza. The photos show a row of freshly dug graves with identification markers, but no stones. The older part of the cemetery with stones can be seen in the background. The CIR used Sentinel-2, which remember is the European Space Agency's satellite, to observe that between February and March, 3 large areas were cleared of trees. In each of these cases, investigators scoured the internet for articles, photos, and videos that would help them geolocate the locations of potential mass grave sites. In Mariupol, there's evidence of, oops, sorry. Oh, you got that one. On the highways between Kiev and Bucha, there is evidence of a massacre of Ukrainian civilians attempting to flee the area. I won't show this video, but this appears to be a very well documented massacre by open sources. Investigators for the Center for Information Resilience have documented the massacre using numerous open source intelligence pieces. The first news of the massacre was posted online by Ukrainian political official Alexei Goncharenko, who posted a video on Twitter which showed a decapitated woman in a car which had been strafed by heavy gunfire. The CIR was able to surmise that the vehicle was hit with machine gun fire and were able to geolocate the incident using features from the video and lining them up with Google Street Maps. Satellite imagery shows a military vehicle in the same location the car was at the time of the incident, and CIR has concluded that the vehicle likely caused the death of the woman. Another view of the highway massacre was posted to Twitter by an advisor to President Zelensky, which was confirmed by satellite. On the same stretch of highway, civilians were targeted by a Russian roadblock. Photos of the dead posted to Twitter were confirmed through geolocation by the CIR. Another Twitter thread posted by the German language magazine Frontal links drone footage of a civilian being shot by the Russian army. The male civilian is seen being pulled to the side of the road where a body is later found burned after the Soviet withdrawal. Again, the CIR was able to use drone footage to geolocate the incident. So what does all this investigation mean in the end? The amount of human hours spent, the digital infrastructure dedicated to collecting and archiving open source evidence and intelligence must be used for future prosecutions of war crimes and possibly of genocide. According to Stefan Schmidt, a forensic investigator of war crimes, local police often do not have the skills needed to document and preserve evidence of international crimes. There are other obstacles as well that complicate investigation during armed conflict. Though the events in Ukraine have been recorded and documented in real time, much of the territory remains occupied, and these events must be corroborated with traditional investigatory techniques. Even though these barriers exist, the verification, preservation, and archiving of open source evidence and intelligence is critically important moving forward. According to the additional protocol 56 of the Geneva Convention, military forces cannot target installations containing dangerous forces. Any military located in an installation containing dangerous forces should not themselves be made a target of an attack. What does that mean? The installations described in the additional protocol include nuclear facilities like this one, which pose a risk to civilians should they be damaged in an artillery barrage. Since the beginning of the conflict, Russia has located troops and military convoys in and around the nuclear power plant in Zaporizhzhia, west of Donetsk. The implication is that they are using the plant itself to deter a directed attack on their military position. Additionally, it's likely that Russia is using the civilians living in and around it as human shields. The CIR has not only confirmed that Russia is present at the nuclear power plant, but that they have also used multiple launch rocket systems in the vicinity. Because of their co-location by the nuclear plant, Russia reduces the risk of retaliatory fire. Russian attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure have been ubiquitous throughout the conflict. Section 8.2b of the Rome Statute to the International Criminal Court prevents intentionally targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure. Directing attacks against non-military civilian targets such as hospitals, residential buildings, supermarkets, train stations, kindergartens would be in direct violation of Section 8.2b. Open source intelligence has been critical in documenting the use of cluster munitions in these attacks, which are indiscriminate weapons and will kill, injure, or maim civilians if detonated in crowded areas. It's unclear how prosecutions can proceed if neither Ukraine nor Russia have signed on to the Convention of Cluster Munitions. The Associated Press had collaborated with Frontline to document almost 653. It looks like they stopped as of February 24th, 2023. Potential war crimes in Ukraine. Their database is composed of open source intelligence, including videos, photographs, and audio recordings. These pieces of intelligence are supplemented by on-the-ground investigations by the AP and Frontline journalists. Their work also includes information from open source investigations from the CIR, Bellingcat, as well as other organizations. As such, multiple organizations are working to confirm, geolocate, and archive open source evidence of war crimes collected during the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Crimes against humanity, and genocide are codified in Articles 6, 7, and 8 of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. A potential complication in the prosecution of war crimes at the ICC is that neither Ukraine or Russia are signatories of the Rome Statute. This means neither country can make referrals to the ICC. However, since the annexation of Crimea and the Maidan protests, Ukraine has agreed to accept the jurisdiction of the ICC within Ukrainian territory. This leads experts to conclude that this will test the limits of the ICC's ability to prosecute war crimes resulting from the Russian invasion in Ukraine. It appears that the concern is not that there isn't enough evidence of war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide in the Russian actions in Ukraine, but rather the question lies in whether or not the ICC actually has jurisdiction. Human Rights Watch, as a result, has called for Ukraine to immediately ratify the Rome Statute and become a formal member of the ICC and to adjust its laws to align with international jurisprudence. In May of 2022, the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy and the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights published a joint report concluding that Russia bears state responsibility for direct and public incitement to commit genocide and a pattern of atrocities from which an inference of intent to destroy the Ukrainian national group in part can be drawn in breach of Article 3C and Article 2 of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Putin has long displayed his willingness to invoke genocidal language against the Ukrainian people. In 2021, prior to the invasion of Ukraine, he wrote and published on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, in which he declared Ukrainians and Russians were of one people, and the Russians presenting with the Russians presenting a clear warning of his aggressive intentions before the invasion. Putin has publicly asserted that Ukraine wasn't and should not be recognized as a sovereign state. He has also declared that those living in Ukraine not loyal to Russia should be eliminated and partially squeezed out, and that Ukrainian cultural heritage should be obliterated through de-Ukrainization. The language is clearly genocidal in its dehumanization, discrimination, preparation, and persecution. Additionally, the documented kidnapping of Ukrainian children is a clear violation of Article 2E of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. While the conflict continues, we must continue to document the stolen children as evidence for potential genocidal charges. In closing, the scorched earth policy Russia has embraced during its invasion in Ukraine has left a rich evidentiary trail that open source investigators can follow. As we've seen, open source intelligence was the primary evidence in at least 10 war crimes cases tried by national authorities in the EU between 2016 and 2018. The Rome Statutes E protocol dictates that digital evidence must be relevant and have probative value and be absence of prejudice. Digital evidence will undoubtedly become of some of the most important pieces of evidence in future war crimes trials. In order to assuage concerns regarding reliability, doctoring, and other issues with digital media, open source investigations must adhere rigorously to the Berkeley Protocol for Open Source Investigations. Ukraine must catalog both digital and physical evidence and work with international authorities to store such material as the conflict drags on. That's what I got.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you
No,
very much, Emily. That was excellent.
no, it's depressing. I apologize.
And at this time, I would like to open up the floor to questions or comments for Emily.
Isn't it like basically we're back to like the Holocaust originally started because of the genocide and the killing of the people and stuff, but the only difference is now it's more well known than it would have been back when the Holocaust was happening? Wouldn't it be like this is basically like what it is? Wait, what's going on? Isn't it like almost like a revisit of the Holocaust and Hitler and all that, with the way Putin's been acting with all the killings and all the massacres and all that? When you like consider it like almost the same thing in a sense?
Well, I think genocides have been happening since.
Well, I know it's been happening for like years on end. But
Yeah.
when like a repeat of like the Holocaust, of like, the massacre and all the killings, but with today's technology and all that, we're more known of like how Putin's been acting because of how it's all over the internet, all over like social media and all that. That's like the only difference as it was back when the Holocaust happened.
It's an interesting question. And like, you know, there's an argument to be made that we absolutely knew the Holocaust was happening. There were people that were in FDR's.
And we knew, but at the same time, it wasn't like it was today, more broad, like out in the open as it was. Or like we want have more information on like the stuff going on with like articles and like different like the news and everything.
Yeah, I guess I would say it's not a Holocaust Part 2 because we're not looking at the same kind of industrial killing, but I would say we are looking at a genocide. I think that's clear. I think international law makes these things very complicated. We're also looking at genocides in places like China and places like Burma that are happening right now, and we know they're happening right now. So, I mean, you know, we have these international laws that we put in place to prevent these things, and yet we sit here and point to Ukraine and point to China and point to Burma and say, but there's genocides happening. So I guess the question really is like, how effective are these international measures that we've put in place? How effective is the ICC? And like, I want to believe that the ICC is effective.
Yeah,
I want to believe that
we all want to believe that.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Anyone else with a question? Rebecca?
Make it an easy one, Rebecca.
Okay. So, I love that you're doing this, that you did this and you presented this today. So I follow a group, some of you might too. It's called A View from My Window. And during COVID, it was supposed to bring people together. It's sort of around the world where you take a picture of what you can see through your window. That's the premise of it. So people from all over the world take a picture of their homes or their vacations or whatever. Since the attack on Israel, there's been a huge upswing of Ukrainian posts. And I'm thinking of this as open source, clearly, because these are, they're supposed to be regular people, although we can always argue that some of these could be Russian bots or whatever. But, and they're not supposed to doctor their stuff. So that interests me, but it also worries me because sometimes the pictures are of a urban scene in Kyiv or in another place where you could clearly see the other people. And I wonder about military, like risks, honestly. And I know that's not the topic of, you're talking about how open source can be used to benefit, but that worries me. And then at the same time, I wonder if like AI could be used to kind of trick, and that opens up a whole other can of worms. The other, please, I would love your response, but the other quick question that I have for you is, to me, Ukraine joining the ICC is a no-brainer. Like, I see why the US hasn't joined, and that's a topic for another day. But like, Ukraine can only benefit this from what I could see. So I wanted your response on that too. So take it away.
So 3 questions, and I appreciate all of them. So I actually, as part of this research, joined a Reddit sub, right? And one of the things that the rules was that you couldn't post troop movement, like, because it was a pro-Ukrainian sub. And it was like, the idea was you couldn't post anything with identifiable marks that would reveal the location of the troops in just that way. Because like the fear was like, if we can figure out where the Russians are, right, then they can figure out where we are. And there's this guy on TikTok that I wish I meant to write it down and I forgot before I came here. It's this guy on TikTok that will, like, if you post it and you say, find me, whoever this guy is, he'll find you. Like, he will use the same kind of techniques that open source intelligence uses, like Google Maps and stuff, and he'll find you. And like, so it's like using Google Maps and things like this. Like, if people are being careless posting military members openly on the internet, there's a chance that they could be located by enemy. Like, because open source is just the same for the other side. They're using our open sources too. If we're posting it, other people can use it. AI risk is interesting. My thoughts on AI, and I looked at this because AI wasn't a thing when I wrote this paper. I started investigating it, and it seemed like AI was like deemed by open source intelligence people as a good thing because it could be deployed to like evaluate things faster. My fear would be it could be used to manipulate the images faster. I think people don't know yet the impact that it's going to have, and I think that that's what we have to keep our eyes on. As far as Ukraine joining the ICC, yes, hands down, they absolutely should. I think they might be afraid that their hands might be tied. I wonder what munitions they might have used, so I think things go both ways. But I think they absolutely should use it because I think there's clear evidence that there's war crimes and genocide that have happened in Ukraine.
Thank you.
Yeah, Farah.
So thank you, Emily, for doing this. And I don't know if I have a question or what, but some of the words you use, war crime, crime against humanity, genocide, and I can't help but think about what's happening right now in Palestine, and I wanted to know if there's any of this digital evidence of anything over there.
Yes. So I thought of you this morning. So I looked at, it looks like Bellingcat is doing investigations in Gaza. And one of the first reports that I remember seeing, and if you guys pay attention, you'll start hearing newscasters referring to open source information, because they talked about there was a bombing of a hospital, and it was horrifying, in Gaza. And there was a lot of trying to figure out where it came from. And one of the things they were trying to do was use open source geolocation and identifying the bomb and like things like this to figure out where in fact it did come from. So it does look like Bellingcat has published a number of, it has, using live streams, here, let me share my screen. Using live streams to monitor the crisis in Gaza, confirming a strike on Jabalia refugee camp as Israeli forces approach, geolocating Hamas-led attacks on Israeli civilians, possible crater from a Gaza hospital blast. So there's a number of things here. Some of the organizations are more focused on Ukraine. I think the Center for Information Resilience is primarily Ukraine focused. But I do know that Bellingcat, and I wouldn't be surprised if Mnemonic got into it, but they tended to be like, so when I wrote my paper, Mnemonic didn't yet have the published Ukraine archive, because they don't publish anything till it's verified. So they might be collecting stuff, you know, like they're very careful with their information technology. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah. And if you're interested in it, you and I could dig through stuff, but
Okay.
hard. Tim.
Yeah, hi, Emily. Thank you so much for presenting this. This is fascinating. I have two questions. First, have you or has this anyone associated with open source documentation noticed a change in the behavior of those who are being documented? In other words, posting less on Facebook that they're involved in certain activities, or on the flip side, perhaps using Russian assets to attack the security vulnerabilities of these open source areas? That's the first question. The second is, you touched on it already. What about the news media? Do you see the news media using these resources more? Is this setting a standard perhaps of, you know, sourcing images and things? I'm curious what your take is on that.
Sure. So I think that it probably depends on the level of awareness of the people posting the information. So a change in your behavior of the people posting. So there's certainly, as I finished writing this, it's clear that people know that the other side will see what they post, right? So as I finished writing this paper about a year ago, December of last year, there were 3 civilians who were lynched in Ukraine for being collaborators with Russia. And they had signs hung on their necks to warn other civilians. And the back and forth in Telegram was the Russians laughing about it and the Ukrainians saying this is we have to document this for a war crime. So that, to complicate things, you know, what's being put out there is propaganda, what can be manipulated. I think that there's a difference between people who are manipulating data, people who are posting it and don't know, like regular trench soldiers, right? Like who are just out there on the front, who are just taking photos and maybe not thinking about it. Does that make sense? I think that in the likelihood is governments realize we're watching and are trying to manipulate this kind of data, you know, and that's why I think that the things like the Berkeley Protocol are so important, that once these digital images are identified, that they're captured so that any subsequent I can't think of a big word right now, messing with is, you know, disrupted, that you know, that we preserve that chain of evidence, if that makes sense. So like I guess in short, I don't know. I think that's for someone above my pay grade to answer. I'll get the head of the Homeland Security on the phone, not Homeland Security, the opposite of Homeland, you know what I mean. I have noticed more people talking about open source intelligence, and I don't know if it's just because I started researching it that I'm like, you know, noticing it more. But I will tell you, the first time I realized my access to conflict data was my use of Twitter during I think it was the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in 2013 or 2014. And I remember following a number of reporters, Palestinian reporters at the time, who were talking about the conditions in Gaza and like what was happening. And like, and I remember being like, oh my God, I'm getting like up to the second like war from people who are there, you know? So I think what newscasters are trying, if they're good, they're worth their salt, right? And I saw Shelley come in, and I'm sure she would second me. You know, they're verifying it before they're posting it, they're talking about it. You know, they have to make sure that anything that is put on the news is verified before they claim what it's right. But they'll say, I have heard them talk about open source investigations. So yeah, it's very interesting stuff. It's very gory and depressing.
Any other questions or comments? And I think that's a good reminder there, Emily, that you brought up at the beginning. I think, right, one of the aspects of open source is that you're probably not going to have as much of a filter there on some of these images and videos that we've kind of grown up somewhat accustomed to with mainstream media, but even on certain other sites that have these kind of barriers, like Reddit being, you know, some of them. So another good warning there, as I did peruse some of the other materials earlier.
Yeah,
Any
no,
other?
it can be a lot. So, I mean, I think it's good to know what's going on, but know your limits, and definitely don't click if you don't have to.
Right. Well, if there are no other questions or comments, I will take this opportunity to once again thank you so much, Emily, for joining us, and to thank everybody who was here to attend and to support Emily and take interest in not only these topics, but more specifically her research on this and the work that she's been doing. And again, one final plug for the spring semester to roll out this great idea of libraries, lectures in the libraries that I'm really looking forward to. So everybody keep an eye out for that. And
It'd
I
be a
hope
lot less depressing.
yeah, and I hope everybody has a great day. Thank you so much.